Jayam Vishnupad Paramhansa Paribrajakacharyasto Tarasata Shri Srimad A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnav Vrinda Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Sikho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar. Abhi koi awaaz nahi aa rahi. Shivasari Gaur Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Jagannath Puri Ki Jai. Gangamayi Jamunamayi Ki Jai. Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Samaveda Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. We're continuing with the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, written by His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami. We're on volume 3, chapter 1, entitled Swami Invites the Hippies. They had just completed the Avalon Ballroom successful fundraiser with Srila Prabhupada getting 3,000 hippies to chant Hare Krishna, chant and dance along with him. It was a great success. Now, the core devotees who had come to open the temple will hear more about how they're helping Prabhupada expand in San Francisco. Mukunda had explained what he had known of Krishna consciousness. This is after Mukunda and Janaki left 26 Second Avenue, and they said they wanted to go to India. They first went to their hometown, which was Portland, Oregon, and they went to see their close school friend, Sam Spirsta, who later became Shyamasundar Das. And he was a forest ranger. He and his girlfriend Melanie, who later became Malati, we saw last week the huge forest tower, and they had a little cabin on the top, and they had to look over thousands of miles of forest to make sure that there were no forest fires. And his life was kind of dead end at that time. You know, you just in a little cabin up in the air, no people around. So Mukunda and Joan, they went to see Sam and Melanie. Mukunda had explained, and he was telling them now about how he had met the Swami. Mukunda had explained what he had known of Krishna consciousness, and the 6 of them had begun chanting Hare Krishna together. So along with Sam and Melanie, Joan got in touch with her sister Jan, who later became Jamuna, and Jan's boyfriend's name was Roger, who later became Gurudas. So now it was 6 people all there, and Mukunda was telling them about the Swami. They had been especially interested in Swami's teachings about elevating consciousness without drugs. Mukunda had talked excitedly about Swamiji's having asked him to start a temple in California. And soon he and his wife, Janaki, Sam and his girlfriend Melanie, and Roger and Joan, now intimate friends, had moved to an apartment in San Francisco to find a storefront. And set the stage for Swamiji. So, Danush has got me this fancy, I have to hold it, huh? Okay, so not visible, huh? No, it doesn't show on the screen. Okay, so this is Jan, that's Jamuna, that's Sam, that's Shamsundar, that's Mukunda, and that's Janaki, and that's Melanie. After Swamiji's arrival, Joan had begun attending the temple kirtans. She felt drawn to Swamiji and the chanting, and she especially liked the informality of Swami's visiting hours. Swamiji would sit in his rocking chair with his hand in his bead bag, chanting the holy names, and Joan would sit fascinated, watching his fingers moving within the bag. So they got the temple on Frederick Street, and then just next to it, they got 2 apartments on the 3rd floor. One was for Prabhupada, and the other was for Mukunda and Janaki. And this is the window, and Prabhupada sitting in his rocking chair there at the window, meeting guests. This is a map that Jamuna made of the apartment. So you see the entrance here. There's the entrance. And then the hallway and the big room, Prabhupada's rocking chair. Then there was a private room of Prabhupada's bedroom. And here's the kitchen. Kitchen has shelves on this side, the sink, and then a bathroom. One day during Swamiji's visiting hours, while Swamiji was sitting in his rocking chair and Joan and others were sitting at his feet, Janaki's cat crept in through the hallway door and began slowly coming down the hallway. The cat came closer and closer and slowly meandered right in front of Swamiji's feet. It sat down, looking up intently at Swamiji, and began to meow. None of the devotees knew what to expect. Swamiji began gently stroking the back of the cat with his foot, saying, "Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, are you feeding him prasadam milk?" So Prabhupada, he even showed compassion to the cat. So the devotees will hear later how this was an obstacle even for Roger to become a devotee, because he had a pet dog. And many of the young men and women had pets, just as Janaki, although she was an initiated devotee, she still had a pet cat. And Prabhupada would not let the animals come into the temple. So they would have to stay outside of the temple, and that would upset the young people, because they consider their animals to be part of their family. And Prabhupada explained that this philosophy is for humans. The animals will not be able to understand the philosophy, although they will get benefit by hearing the chanting of Hare Krishna. Joan, I was touched by Swamiji's activities and his kindness, even to cats, and I longed for more association with him. Joan came to understand that serving Swamiji was a serious matter, but she didn't want to jump into initiation until she was 100% sure about it. Sometimes she would cry in ecstasy, and sometimes she would fall asleep during Swamiji's lecture. So she remained hesitant and skeptical, wondering, how can I actually apply Swamiji's teachings to my life? So at this point, of course, no one understood the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. They only knew Swamiji, and they were falling in love with Srila Prabhupada. From him, he was spoon-feeding each one of them, through his books, through his regular lectures, through his kirtans. So he was the magnet that was drawing them. They didn't know about Krishna except for what Prabhupada told them. He was the via medium through which everything spiritual was coming. So they were attracted to him. Because they were attracted to him, they were attracted to Krishna consciousness. One evening, Swamiji asked her, "When are you going to be initiated?" Joan said that she didn't know, but that she relished reading his books and chanting Hare Krishna. She said that because she was attracted to the mountains and to elevated spiritual consciousness, she wanted to travel to Tibet. Swamiji, sitting in his rocking chair, looked down at Joan as she sat at his feet. She felt he was looking right through her. "I can take you to a higher place than Tibet," he said. "Just see." So maybe you remember many classes previously when Prabhupada went with a group of devotees to Dr. Mishra's ashram. And there it's in the mountains, it's very peaceful and beautiful. And Brahmananda, he had been reading a book by Aldous Huxley's wife. He was a famous writer at that time, Brave New World. And she said that the spiritual vibrations are much better in the mountains. So Brahmananda asked Prabhupada, is it true that you can do better meditation in the mountains because of the ions and the negative and positive forces? And Prabhupada just immediately rejected. He said, Krishna's in your heart. Krishna's everywhere. It doesn't matter where you chant. You can always be with Krishna because he's always with you. Joan suddenly felt that Swamiji knew everything about her, and she understood. Oh, I have to see through his eyes what Krishna consciousness is. He was promising that he would take her to some very elevated realm, but she would have to see it. It was then that Joan decided to become Swamiji's disciple. So one by one, Srila Prabhupada, he was able to not only attract the devotees, but when we were in Prabhupada's personal presence, we could feel that Prabhupada could understand everything we were thinking, and he could understand our inner consciousness. So it was at this time that Joan realized that if she really wanted to get to a higher realm, she was going to have to submit herself to her teacher, who says that he could take her there. And that was when she decided, even though she would fall asleep in his classes sometimes, that it would be better to become his disciple, to become his student. When she told her boyfriend Roger, he was astounded. He and Joan had been coming to the kirtans and lectures together, but he still had doubts. Maybe it would be good for him and Joan to get married, but not initiated. Joan, however, was more determined. She explained to Roger that Swamiji hadn't come just to perform marriages. You had to get initiated first. So this was Prabhupada's rule in all of our marriages. In fact, there's one exchange of correspondence. A very early devotee named Tejas Das. He was the one who started our temple in Delhi in the 1970s. He had been a Peace Corps worker in India, so he had learned Telugu. So he was able to communicate with the MPs and the higher-ups, because many of them were from South India. So when he joined in Buffalo, where Rupanuga had set up his center, we heard about Rupanuga before, he wanted to marry a young girl, a devotee, named Madira. So they wrote to Prabhupada. We always had to write and ask permission from Srila Prabhupada to get married. And they spelled his name wrong in the letter, Tejios. It sounded like some Hispanic name. So Prabhupada wrote back in the letter that they both have to be initiated before they get married. And the reason for that is that after you're married, you have to have a Krishna conscious wet marriage, and you're following the 4 regulative principles together. So that was why first initiation and then marriage. Now it's all upside down. But that was Prabhupada's program. We always had to get first initiated and then get married, so that we would together, husband and wife, follow the four regulative principles. Roger Siegel had grown up in New York. He was following a Hatha Yoga guru and had experimented with psychedelic chemicals, LSD, and had traveled in the Deep South as a civil rights activist, taking part in freedom marches with the blacks. So at that time in the 60s, maybe you've all heard of apartheid in South Africa, where the whites are segregated. They segregate the blacks. They're different parts of the city, different schools, everything different. Different parts of the buses where only black people were allowed to sit. So in the south part of America, it was mostly agrarian, agriculture. And the slaves were brought from Africa to work in these farms in the south. The north was industrialized, so nobody needed slaves there. But to do all of the harvesting and the cotton plucking and the picking of the cutting of the grains, they used slaves, African slaves. So the Americans who came from Europe, from England, from Spain, from France, from Portugal, they were in charge of the land because they had driven out the Indians, and they brought these slaves, the black slaves from Africa. And they were chained and they were sold in the markets. It was terrible. And although it was the 20th century, it was 1960s, the black people in southern part of America were still being treated as second-class citizens. They only had particular places where they could shop, where they could live, where they could go to schools, completely separated schools. So the government was trying to change that, to put them all together instead of segregating them. And there was huge uproars. So Roger Siegel, he took part in that on behalf of the blacks in their favor to help them with their civil rights movements. So he was very active as a humanist in that way before he became a devotee. He has a book that we have in the library that explains that part of his life. Large-bodied and sociable and outgoing, he had lots of friends in San Francisco. At the airport, in a merry mood with the Haight-Ashbury crowd, he had seen Swamiji for the first time and been especially struck by Swamiji's regal bearing and absence of self-consciousness. So this picture was not from that time. This picture is actually when Gurudas was our temple president here, and he's going for a walk with Prabhupada on the main road in front of our temple when it was just jungle there. There were no houses, no shops, nothing, just a few trees. But it was the only picture I could find of him. The concept of reincarnation had always intrigued him, but after attending some of Swamiji's lectures and hearing him explain transmigration of the soul, he felt he had found someone who definitely knew the answer to any question about life after death. Because even in the Buddhist philosophy, it's quite, it's not a real explanation of what happens after death. Christianity also, there's some vague concept of heaven, hell, and purgatory. In Judaism, there's practically no description of life after death. You just die, and then you wait till the Messiah comes, and then everyone rises up from their coffins and starts a new life. It's very vague. But because Srila Prabhupada, he had the Vedas, and particularly the Bhagavad Gita, second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, everything is very clearly explained by Krishna to Arjuna about what happens to the soul, how the changing of bodies is like changing your dress. And this was very enlightening for Guru Das, because in all the other world religions, he couldn't find the answers to his questions until he heard Srila Prabhupada's lectures. One night, after attending the program at the temple, Raja returned to his apartment and sat down on the fire escape to meditate on what Swamiji had said. "The world is false," he had said, "but it feels real to me," Raja thought. "If I pinch my arm, I feel pain. So how is that illusion? This fire escape is real. Otherwise, I would be falling in space. This space is real, isn't it?" So he was confused about what Prabhupada meant by illusion. What is illusion and what is real? Because for him, consciousness meant real. And the things that he saw, they appeared to be quite real. So he didn't understand how Prabhupada was using the word illusion. Roger decided he didn't understand what Swamiji meant by illusion. If I try to walk through the wall, he thought, would that be real or not? Maybe the wall's reality is just in my mind. To test the illusion, he went inside his apartment, concentrated his mind, and walked against the wall. Smack. He sat down again and thought, what does Swamiji mean when he says that the world is illusion? He decided he should ask at the next meeting. He did. And Srila Prabhupada told him that actually the world is real because it was created by God, the supreme reality. But it is unreal in the sense that everything material is temporary. When a person takes the temporary world to be permanent and all in all, he is in illusion. Only the spiritual world, Swamiji explained, is eternal and therefore real. Roger was satisfied by Swamiji's answer. So I remember the first time I got to go on a morning walk with Srila Prabhupada. He was coming out of his rooms at the New York temple, and he was talking to his servant. And he was saying to his servant, what is truth? So I immediately said to Prabhupada, I said, because everything is coming from Krishna, everything is true. And Prabhupada said yes. So the material world, it's also real. Everything is real. All of the elements are real. But because it's temporary, therefore it's called illusion. So therefore we have to understand the difference between the real world, which is the spiritual world, and the temporary, this illusory world, which we're thinking is real, but only temporary. But he had other difficulties. He thought Swamiji was too conservative. When Swamiji said the people's dogs must be kept outside the temple, Roger didn't like it. Many visitors brought pet dogs with them to the temple, and now there was a hitching post in front of the building just to accommodate the pets on leashes. But Swamiji would not allow any pets inside. This philosophy is for humans, he said. A cat or dog cannot understand it, although if he hears the chanting of Hare Krishna, he can receive a higher birth in the future. We were once having a Bhagavatam class here, and it was before everything was developed, and a cow started walking into the temple, just right in the front gate of the temple. And they had to drive the cow back out, because the cows used to wander everywhere here. The first thing that Prabhupada did when he got the land was, he had the devotees make a water trough at the front of the temple so that the cows would have water to drink there, because we had sweet water. So as the cow had to leave the temple, the Bhagavatam speaker, it was our temple president, one sannyasi, he was saying that, just see, he might have been a human in his last lifetime, and he could have easily sat in the temple, but now he's in a cow body, and he's not allowed into the temple, because we don't allow animals into the temple. So it was an example of how we have to take this human form of life very seriously, because only in this human form of life will we have the opportunity to hear spiritual knowledge. Raju also had other points of contention with what he considered Swamiji's conservative philosophy. Swamiji repeatedly spoke against uncontrolled habits like smoking, but Roger couldn't imagine giving up such things. We'll hear later that when Prabhupada told Shyam Sundar that he should carve Lord Jagannath from the little Jagannath, he wanted a big Jagannath made. So Shyam Sundar was carving very nicely, and Prabhupada came in one day, and on Jagannath's head was a pack of cigarettes, because even he was still smoking. So even though they were initiated, it was very difficult for them to give up their habits, their previous habits. And the instructions about restricted sex life especially bothered him. Yet despite his not following very strictly, Roger felt himself developing a love for Swamiji and Krishna. And here's that love net that Srila Prabhupada was pulling all the devotees in. That they didn't want to give up their bad habits, but because they loved Prabhupada, and as a result of that they loved Krishna, gradually they were willing to give up their bad habits. He sensed that Swamiji had much more to teach him, and that Swamiji was doing it in a certain way and a certain order. Roger knew that Swamiji saw him as a baby in spiritual life who had to be spoon-fed. He knew he had to become submissive and accept whatever Swamiji gave him. So Gurudas, he wrote a beautiful book called By His Example. We have it here. We've printed it for him. And he explains all that he went through in order to become a devotee. It's a very, very interesting book, very humorous book, all of his exchanges with Prabhupada. So if you have time, you can read his book called By His Example. Sam Spirsta, tall and slender with curly reddish gold hair, was athletic. He had trained as an Olympic skier. Yet artistic, he was a writer and wood sculptor. He had graduated from Reed College in Oregon. That was the same college that Jamuna had gone to. She was learning fancy writing called calligraphy, and he was a wood sculptor. And gone on as a Fulbright scholar to a small college in Switzerland, where he had obtained an MA, Masters of Arts, in philosophy. He was popular, as Mukunda saw him, the epitome of the rugged individualist. Now, Shyam Sundar, he's now written 3 books called Chasing Rhinos with the Swami. Part 1 is his meeting with Prabhupada in San Francisco, and then going on to Montreal, and then Prabhupada sending them on to London. And then the next part is when Shyam Sundar and the same 6 devotees are in London together, and they develop the London Temple, meet the Beatles, and how Krishna consciousness develops from there in Europe. And then how Prabhupada has them all come to India to assist him there. That's part 3. Very interesting books, if you have time to read them. They're all in Prabhupada's library. When Mukunda had visited Sam at his mountain lookout tower and told him about Swamiji and Krishna consciousness, Sam had been intrigued by the new ideas. Sam's life had nearly reached a dead end, but he had seen hope in what Mukunda and Janaki had been saying about Swamiji. After spending only a few days with Mukunda, Sam had been eager to help him establish a temple of Krishna consciousness in San Francisco. So you can imagine living in the middle of a forest with no other people around at all, and your job was to climb up. In fact, that's where you lived, up in that cabin up there. And this is what the cabin looked like on the inside. On all four sides were windows, and all day long you just had to look out the windows to make sure that there were no fires. That's a pretty dead-end life. So, Sam was the one who knew the local rock stars and had persuaded them to appear at the Avalon with Swami Bhaktivedanta, whom he had never met. Sam had seen Swamiji for the first time when Swamiji had arrived at the San Francisco airport, and Sam had later insisted that he had seen a flash of light come from Swamiji's body. So there's Sam there with his red hair. And you can read actually the whole first part of, let's say the whole first half of the first volume of Chasing Rhinos with the Swami is all of Sam's previous life experiences. So you have to go through a lot until he finally comes to the point in his life where he meets Prabhupada and becomes a devotee. A lot of drugs, a lot of other types of experiences. But you see the spiritual development that way of one very, very important disciple of Srila Prabhupada. At first, Sam had been afraid to say anything, nor had he known what to say. Prabhupada was completely new to him and seemed so elevated. But the day after the program at the Avalon, when Mukunda told Prabhupada that Sam had arranged the dance, Prabhupada sent for him to find out how much money they had made. Sitting across from Prabhupada, who sat behind his small desk, Sam informed him that they had made about $1,500 profit. Well then, Srila Prabhupada said, you will be the treasurer. Then Srila Prabhupada asked him, what is your idea of God? God is one, Sam replied. Prabhupada asked, what is the purpose of worshiping God? Sam replied, to become one with God. No, Prabhupada said, you cannot become one with God. God and you are always two different individuals. But you can become one in interest with him. And then he told Sam about Krishna. After they talked, Prabhupada said, you can come up every day and I will teach you how to do books. Books means accounting books. So Sam began meeting with Prabhupada for half an hour a day to learn bookkeeping. Now, every day we say, Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namine. Now that's a standard prayer, and even if you have a guru who's a disciple of Prabhupada, then you just put the guru's name in there. We say Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami because that's Prabhupada's sannyas name. But then the next sloka that we sing, Namaste Saraswati Deve, Gauravani Pracharine, Nirvishesha Sunyavari, Paschatya Deshatarine. Nirvishesha, that means that the Lord has no qualities. Sunyavadi, Mayavad, just to become one with God. Paschatya Deshatarni, in the Western countries. So because in the Western countries, they had no real concept of who God is, or even that he was a person, that Nirvishesha Sunyavadi, Prabhupada came to give the Gauravani, Namaste Saraswati Devi, Gauravani Pracharine, to preach the message of Lord Chaitanya to whom? To those in the Western countries who were Nirvisheshavadis and Mayavadis. So sometimes in the early days, they would ask Prabhupada, where are the Mayavadis? We don't, because here in India, we know who the Mayavadis are. They wear like this and they carry ekadanda. You know, just by the way they look, we know who the Mayavadis are. But how do you identify Mayavadis in America? Well, everybody's a Mayavadi in America because they don't know who God is. So the Mayavadis were us. That's who Prabhupada was preaching to, just as here. Sam, I had never been very good at keeping books, and I really didn't want to do it. But it was a good excuse to come and see Swamiji every day. He would chew me out, that means he would chastise me, when I would spend too much money or when I couldn't balance the books properly. I really loved the idea that he was so practical that he knew bookkeeping. Prabhupada knew everything. He was an expert at everything. He became so much more of a friend from the beginning, rather than some idolized person from another sphere of life. I took almost all my practical questions to him. I learned to answer things for myself based on the way Swamiji always answered day-to-day problems. And the first thing he made me do was to get married to my girlfriend. It's very practical. You're living together, get married. So that there they are together getting married. Now you notice in all these marriage ceremonies, there's only one sari. And that was a sari that Mukunda had bought for Janaki. It was the only sari they had in marriage. So each time there was a marriage, they would wear Janaki's sari. And there were no dhotis in those days. So when they tied the two knots together, they tied Malati's sari to his belt strap. Mukunda and his wife Janaki, whose apartment was just down the hall from Srila Prabhupada's, were the only couple Srila Prabhupada had already initiated and married. Mukunda, who often wore his strand of large red japa beads in two loose loops around his neck, had grown long hair and a short, thick black beard since coming to San Francisco. He had entered the summer of love spirit of Haight-Ashbury and was acquainted with many of the popular figures. So remember, he and Janaki were the only initiated devotees at that time, and here was Mukunda, if you can see. There are his beads, there's his beard, and there's his long hair. So he was trying to fit right in with all the hippies there, and that way he was able to access them a lot easier rather than having a shaved head and a sika. There he is again in the back. He was a musician, so he got in this big drum, was playing that during Prabhupada's kirtans on Hippie Hill. Although occasionally earning money as a musician, he spent most of his time promoting Prabhupada's mission, especially by meeting people to arrange the gala program at the Avalon and a few much smaller programs at head shops. Remember what a head shop is? Okay, a head shop. All right. Here we have kirana dukans, right? The general stores, they carry everything, right? If you need combs, if you need basin, anything you need, you can find at the kirana dukan, right? So here we're living in hippie land, right? So whatever the hippies needed for their psychedelic life, if they needed paper to roll marijuana, if they needed psychedelic posters, if they needed books about meditation, if anything that had to do with hippie life, that was the kirana dukan of the hippies, was called the head shops. Okay? So in these head shops, in the front would be all of the merchandise, all the things that you needed for your hippie life. If you needed, we learned about the God's eyes and peacock feathers, all kinds of things, whatever you wanted to look like a hippie. There would be a back room. And in the back room, there would be all types of these psychedelic posters, and it would be dark. And sometimes people would go back there to meditate. They would go back there to take their intoxication and to just hang out. So what Mukunda would do was, he would arrange for these backroom kirtan programs. So they would have kirtan, and they would give a little lecture about Krishna consciousness, small scale, in these little back rooms for the hippies. So Mukunda was also arranging those things in the head shops. He was a leader in bringing people to assist Prabhupada, yet he had no permanent sense of commitment. No permanent sense. Now he's in his 80s, Mukunda, one of the first disciples. He's just out of humility saying no commitment. But from the very beginning, up until this very day, he's still preaching Krishna consciousness. He, after going from America to Europe, now and for so many years, he was the Minister of Communications for all of India. Now he went to New Zealand to preach. Now he preaches, he's in Australia. He's become an Australian citizen, and his headquarters are at Murwillumbah. He's an initiated disciple. So out of humility, he might say he didn't have a permanent sense of commitment, but actually Mukunda Goswami's entire life has been dedicated to Srila Prabhupada. And his book is called Miracle on Second Avenue. We've referred to that many times in the past when we were discussing the Second Avenue development, the temple at 26 Second Avenue. He was helping because it was fun. Having little desire to be different from his many San Francisco friends, he did not strictly follow Prabhupada's principles for regulated spiritual life. So this is another big difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. East Coast, New York and everything, it was a little more conservative. So the devotees tried to, as a group, to follow the regulative principles. On the West Coast, sunshine, beach, ocean, surfing, hippies, unlimited amount of drugs, because that's where they would pass out LSD freely, unlimited amount of all the free sex you wanted. It didn't matter because that's the way people lived there. So he also was not following very strictly at that time the principles for regulated spiritual life. But because he was mixing with all the hippies, therefore he was able to attract them, bring them to the temple, arrange this whole big program, the Avalon Ballroom program, and that way thousands of devotees were made. In his exchanges with Srila Prabhupada, Mukunda liked to assume a posture of fraternal camaraderie rather than one of menial servitude, and Srila Prabhupada reciprocated. Sometimes, however, Prabhupada would assert himself as the teacher. Once, when Prabhupada walked into Mukunda's apartment, because it was just down the hallway, he noticed a poster on the wall showing a matador with a cape and sword going after a bull. "This is a horrible picture," Srila Prabhupada exclaimed, his face showing displeasure. Mukunda looked at the poster, realizing for the first time what it meant. "Yes, it is horrible," he said, and tore it off the wall. So there are different parts of the world, particularly in Spain and other Hispanic colonies, where they have a big stadium and they raise very powerful, very powerful bulls who have almost no contact with human beings. They're allowed to roam and live however they want. They become very strong. And they bring them into this arena, and a man called a matador, the goal is to kill the bull. And that's the sport. And people in the whole stadium are watching this fight. Now, sometimes the bull wins and kills the matador, but the matador at that time has helpers, and they all come in to help so that the bull is eventually killed. So it's a horrible, horrible sport of killing a bull. And Mukunda had such a picture right in his apartment, so it was only because Prabhupada pointed it out that he then tore it off the wall. Srila Prabhupada was eager to have somebody play the mridanga properly during the kirtans, and Mukunda, a musician, was a likely candidate. Mukunda. One day, a clay mridanga came that Swamiji had ordered from India. I asked him if I could learn to play it, and he said yes. I asked him when, and he said, "When do you want?" "Now?" I asked. He said, "Yes." I was a little surprised to get such a quick appointment, but I brought the drum to his room, and he began to show me the basic beat. First there was gi-ta-ta, 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 and then one slightly more complicated beat, gi-ta-ta, gi-ta. And we can remember that from the time Srila Prabhupada was a little boy, his father insisted that he have mridanga lessons. And his mother objected. What's he going to do? How's it going to help him in his life to learn mridanga? But his father insisted that, no, this is very important. He should learn mridanga. So with that insistence, now Prabhupada, he had asked the devotees, his godbrothers, to send the mridanga. It arrived in one piece. Now the first mridanga had come to America. And just as when Mukunda and Janaki got they got initiated, Prabhupada then said to them, now you should get married. And they asked when, and he said, tomorrow. Just like that. So same thing, when do you want to learn? Now. Okay. So immediately, Prabhupada, he had nothing better to do than to help his disciples advance in Krishna consciousness. As I began to play the beat, I kept speeding it up, and he kept telling me to slow down. He spent a lot of time just showing me how to strike the heads of the drum. Then I finally began to get it a little. But he had to keep admonishing me to slow down and pronounce the syllables as I hit the drum. Gi-ta-ta. The syllables, he said, and the drum should sound the same. I should make it sound like that and always pronounce them. So you can imagine how fortunate Mukunda was to get these personal lessons from Srila Prabhupada. There are tapes of Prabhupada teaching Mridanga. You can hear them on, probably on YouTube. Prabhupada teaching the different mantras for learning the Mridanga. Now this is a very important concept. When there's a kirtan leader, the musicians who are playing the kartals and playing the mridanga, they have to follow the kirtan leader, because a lot of times the musicians will try to speed up the kirtan. But in following in kirtan, the musicians should follow at the pace that the kirtan leader is singing. So Prabhupada was teaching Mukunda from the very start. You have to go slowly, and the sound of the mantra has to be the same sound that's coming from the mridanga. Slowly. I was determined and played very slowly for a long, long time. I was concentrating with great intensity. Then suddenly I was aware of Swamiji standing motionless beside me. I didn't know how long he was going to stand there without saying anything, and I became a little uncomfortable. But I continued playing. When I got up the courage to look up and see his face, to my surprise, he was moving his head back and forth in an affirming way with his eyes closed. He seemed to be enjoying the lesson. This came as a complete surprise to me. Although I had taken music lessons before and had spent many years taking piano lessons, I can never remember an instance when the teacher seemed to actually enjoy my playing. I felt very wonderful to see that here was a teacher who was so perfect, who enjoyed what he was teaching so much, not because it was his personal teaching or his personal method, but because he was witnessing Krishna's energy pass through him to a conditioned soul like myself, and he was getting great pleasure out of it. I had a deeper realization that Swamiji was a real teacher, although I had no idea what a spiritual master really was. So Srila Prabhupada also, here, in the morning times, Prabhupada would give the Srimad Bhagavatam class. But in the evening times, he would sit under the tamal tree in a chair. All the devotees would be sitting at his feet, and he would point to one devotee and say, "Now you give the Bhagavad Gita class." No one knew who was going to be picked that night. And Prabhupada would listen to the whole class. So everyone had to be ready. And Prabhupada would listen to the devotees' classes. It's not that he had to give every single class. He wanted us to give classes, and we had to be ready to give classes anytime he would point at us. To Mukunda's wife Janaki, Krishna consciousness meant dealing in a personal way with Swamiji. As long as he was around, she was all right. She enjoyed asking him questions, serving him, and learning from him how to cook. She didn't care much for studying the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, but she quickly developed an intense attraction for him. Now, this is a problem that we face in our Krishna consciousness. And this is a big problem that happened after Srila Prabhupada left this world. Those devotees who were Prabhupada's personal servants and had a lot of personal association with him, the Vapu, When Srila Prabhupada left the planet, because they didn't care much for studying the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, when Srila Prabhupada left their personal presence, many of them also left Krishna consciousness. You understand? Because they were dependent on the personal association of Srila Prabhupada. So that's why the Vani and the Vapu are both very, very important. But of the two, the Vani is more important. We have to understand the philosophy of Krishna consciousness if we want to make spiritual advancement, because eventually the spiritual master will disappear from our sight. So therefore we have to have that Vani so that we're always associating with our spiritual master through his instructions. And that's why one time when the devotee asked about, do you ever miss your spiritual master? They asked that to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, I'm always with my spiritual master. I'm always feeling his presence because of his Vani. So therefore we have to very, very carefully, side by side, have both the Vapu and the Vani. Janaki. There was a group of us sitting around in Swamiji's apartment, and I asked him if he had any children. He looked at me as if I had said something strange. Oh, kya hua? Okay. And he said, you are not my child? I said, well, yes. And he said, are not all of these my children? And his answer was so quick that I never doubted that he seriously meant what he said. Later, Prabhupada would say when he was in Seattle that I gave up 5 children and now I have hundreds of children. For several hours each morning, Prabhupada showed Janaki, Joan, and others how to cook. One day in the kitchen, he noticed a kind of berry he had never tasted, and he asked Janaki what they were. She told him strawberries. He immediately popped one into his mouth, saying, that's very tasty. And he proceeded to eat another and another, exclaiming, very tasty. One time, Janaki was making whipped cream when Prabhupada came into the kitchen and asked, what's that? She replied, it's whipped cream. What is whipped cream? He asked. It's cream, she replied, but when you beat it, it fluffs up into a more solid form. Although always adamant about kitchen rules, one of the most important being that no one could eat in the kitchen, Srila Prabhupada immediately dipped his finger into the whipped cream and tasted it. This is yogurt, he said. Now, we don't have whipped cream here. How you make whipped cream is you take malai, and there's a machine, what's it called, a mixer? It's like a mixie, but it's much more powerful. And you put it into this special machine, and it mixes it with such force that it fluffs up, and it becomes like a cloud practically. Very, very tasty. So Prabhupada had never seen that before because it takes a machine to make it. In a light-hearted, reprimanding way that was her pleasure, Janaki replied, no, Swamiji, it's whipped cream. Srila Prabhupada corrected her, no, it's yogurt. And again he put his finger into it and tasted it, saying, oh, it tastes very nice. Swamiji, Janaki accused him, you're eating in the kitchen. Srila Prabhupada merely smiled and shook his head back and forth, saying, that's all right. You can remember when Prabhupada was first teaching the devotees how to cook, he took one of the laddus that he had made and threw it in his mouth. For Prabhupada, it's okay. Not for us. Although at one point, when I was cooking for Prabhupada, the servant came in and he said to me, you have to taste everything you cook before you give it to Prabhupada. I said, why? Why do I have to say it? I want to give it to Prabhupada first. He said, no, you have to make sure it tastes right. Because sometimes the devotees put too much salt, they wouldn't put enough salt, it would be sour. So that's why he said that we had to taste everything before we gave it to Prabhupada. All right, we seem to be having some technical difficulties, and it's after 7 o'clock, so we'll continue next week. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Jai.